to know how to live the way God intended? Then this podcast series is tailor-made for you. David Taverner asks Bible expert Mike Beaumont why Jesus spoke about living God's way using parables. And Mike will sum up what this means for us today in just 3 words.
It's great to see you again, Mike.
Great to be back, David.
And we begin a brand new podcast series all about parables in the Bible. But what is a parable?
What is a parable? Well, it's one of those things that we use the word, throw it out. People talk about the parables of Jesus, don't they? But what actually is one? Well, my earliest memory of being told what a parable was from my old grandma, who was in the Salvation Army. And she used to teach me from a very early age that a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And you know what? In some ways, that's not a bad definition. Clearly, it's stuck all these years on, hasn't it? It's definitely an earthly story because they're rooted in everyday life. The trouble is with the heavenly meaning, it can make it sound like it's a bit out there and otherworldly, and it doesn't quite connect with here. It's certainly about God's kingdom, but that, of course, isn't just the future. It's right here and now. So I'd want to widen it these days. It's absolutely an earthly story, a story from everyday life. But it's really a story or illustration, because they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, to get you thinking. In fact, our English word parable comes from 2 Greek words, parabole. Para alongside ballet, thrown down. Parabole, one thing thrown down alongside another. An illustration, something to compare or illuminate. And there was a Hebrew tradition of this. They had a particular word for it, a mashal, which meant a parable, a proverb, a maxim, a riddle, a comparison, a contrast, an illustration, a story. You can see it's quite wide-ranging, isn't it? So it's any sort of picture that brings one thing alongside another to help explain it or illustrate it. But the key is to get you thinking.
Right.
Rather than just giving you the answer, this is that. To tell a story that gets you looking and thinking about God and you and the world and the Old Testament scriptures. So there are a wide range of stories, sayings, one-liners, some quite long stories, but all designed to get you thinking about, as we've called this series, living life God's way.
Okay. And interesting that something that I suppose might initially seem a bit baffling, a parable, is actually designed to help you understand.
Yes and no. Because there will be times when some of the parables that Jesus will tell will be so obvious that they punch you in the nose. In fact, we find on a few occasions when the religious leaders get offended because they knew he had told this parable against them. So they were pretty clear what he meant. But then there are other times when the stories left people, even his own disciples, scratching their heads and saying to one another, what did he mean by that? Or perhaps coming back to him when the crowd had gone and saying, Master, can you explain that one to us? We didn't quite get it. And Jesus, I think a little bit tongue-in-cheek at times, just, are you still so stupid that you can't get this? So at times they were so obvious. At times not as obvious. But whichever kind they were definitely designed to get you thinking.
Now, this series is called Bible Parables in 30 Minutes. How many parables are there in the Bible?
Oh, well, there are lots of parables in the whole Bible. In fact, when I first sat down, when we decided to do this series, I thought, okay, let me go through the Bible, literally started turning the pages, jotting them all down, found far too many to be able to include in our own series. So what we decided to do was to home in on the parables of Jesus. And again, it depends how you count them. There are at least 30 classic parables, but probably up to 100 if you include his sort of one-liners and figures of speech. So we're going to start with those, and we're going to set them in the context of Jesus's life flow and ministry. Now, we did that in a much fuller way in our previous series, Jesus Then and Now in 30 Minutes, which we can refer listeners to. But we're going to follow these parables of Jesus through, and at various points, we're going to link them to parables from elsewhere in the Bible. So we'll often go back into the Old Testament or some in the New Testament and try and draw some of those other many parables in, because it's a very, very common way of teaching. In fact, it was a very common way of teaching in the ancient world.
Right.
It wasn't just Bible times, of course. Think of Aesop's fables, which are well known. Parable of the tortoise and the hare that we still tell today. So it was a very common way of communicating truth. It wasn't like, only simpletons use and tell parables, don't they? Some very clever people throughout history have used parables. A very Jewish way of teaching. The two main rabbinic schools, Rabbi Shammai and Hillel, both used parables. And yet, there was something about what Jesus did with parables that lifted it to another level. It's as if for him, the parable wasn't an illustration, like perhaps a preacher's illustration these days. The parable often was the teaching. And he simply left you with that, and it had a punch and a power to it and a provocation beneath it that no one else had ever been able to manage before.
You just mentioned some rabbinic schools. What do you mean by that?
Well, there were lots of Jewish rabbis, and they all developed their own teaching emphases. A little bit like in the church today, I suppose, aren't there? There are different theologies or different Bible teachers, and people like to follow this one rather than this one. Well, it was exactly the same in Jewish times. But there were two in particular, Rabbi Shammai and Hillel, and they had slightly different emphases on different issues, but quite clear emphases on different issues. So this was very common, and people often identified themselves with one school rather than another. The thing is, Jesus managed to upset both of them and everyone else as well. He wouldn't align himself with any school or famous preacher, as it were, in his passion to communicate God's truth.
So he took a completely different approach, and that stood out. What in particular about his style of use of parables would you want to highlight?
Well, I like to think of there being four fundamental characteristics of Jesus's teaching. And it was these four together, like four strands of a rope wrapped together, that gave them their individuality and yet their power. Mm-hmm. And I sum it up like this. They were simple, succinct, shocking, and searching.
All S's, yeah.
All S's. I'm a preacher, aren't I? Shall I unpack those a bit?
Yeah.
Simple. First thing is, all his parables were based on everyday life in the Israel of Jesus's day. By everyday life, I mean he would draw them from nature. Mm-hmm. Pictures like seeds growing, from customs, habits that people would be familiar with, like sheep wandering off and getting lost and the farmer having to go and look for it yet again, or a housewife working yeast into dough. These are everyday things.
Very relatable.
Very relatable. Recent events. For example, Herod had gone to Rome to be appointed king, and he'll tell a parable about a king went off to a distant country to be appointed, and people would be smiling and thinking, oh, we know who you mean. Life situations. There's a parable about a steward skimming the profits from his master's account, and you can imagine people nodding there thinking, I've met someone like that, been done by him last week. So very simple in that they were drawn from the everyday life of his time. Second, they were always very succinct, very concise. They omitted all unnecessary description.
He didn't waste words.
No, absolutely not. You're often thinking, yeah, but how tall was he? What did he look like? What was she like? Where did she come from? What was she eating? And all
in the story, yeah.
Yeah, and he just doesn't do that. Straight to the point. Only the main details are kept. Why? To keep the story going. We've all listened to people, and we've started telling us a story, and then they sort of went off at a tangent as they thought of something, and that took them on another tangent, and then they say, where was I? And you think, I've no idea, really. And you've lost the point. Well, Jesus doesn't do that.
He doesn't waffle.
He doesn't waffle, not at all. These are punchy, these are succinct, these are concise. So simple, succinct. My third point is they were shocking. Now, this is one of the ones that really he makes his own. Because while all the parables start out as an apparently ordinary story.
Yeah.
A man went off on a journey one day. They usually end up challenging traditional thinking. So think, for example, of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Man's going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He gets mugged on the way. Well, people would be nodding and saying, well, that was stupid, wasn't it? Going off on a road like that. And you and I have been there, stood on that road. We know how abandoned and desolate and it is. And you can imagine people nodding in agreement. So he's got them. They understand.
It could have happened.
Absolutely. And it probably had happened, perhaps even to some of them and certainly their friends. And so he gets mugged. And then Jesus says, end of story. And then a priest comes by. And the immediate thought is, oh, yeah, well, here comes his help. But he walks by. Oh. And then the Levite comes. And he walks by. Oh. And then a Samaritan comes, a hated Samaritan, one of those people that Jews hated going right back to the time of the return from exile. And it's the Samaritan who stops and helps him while the priest and the Levite walk by. This was utterly shocking.
So for the Jewish listener, the last person on earth they would have thought of.
Absolutely. But it's the last person on earth who actually stops and who helps. Or think of another one where the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector who come before God. And, who is it who goes away justified? Well, any good Jew would know who the answer is. It must be the Pharisee. He's serious about keeping the law, isn't he? Not the sinner, this dreadful guy. But in Jesus' parable, it's the sinner who goes away justified. And that would have left people scratching their heads. So they're shocking in the sense that they're meant to get you to stop in your tracks and to make you think. And the punchline will often come right at the end of the story when he tells them. So I often say to people, a really good way of listening to the parables of Jesus is to try and put yourself into the situation of the time. Imagine you were a good Jew living at that time and you hear this story. Can you hear how this would have impacted you? It would have been utterly shocking what he was saying.
And it's important for us to do that then as we read these and not just immediately apply them to our sort of 21st century life.
Yeah, absolutely, because we miss out an important step then, don't we? We often miss the very point that Jesus wanted to bring out, and we miss the shock factor. So we've got to find a way of getting ourselves back into the story, and we'll help listeners do that as we go through this series to see how very shocking they were. So simple, succinct, shocking, and then that leads to my fourth S, searching. Because none of the parables are told for parable's sake. Sometimes I've heard preachers tell stories, and I think that was a funny story, but what was the point of it? Maybe just to, get the crowd on his side or whatever. But all of Jesus's stories were searching because they sought to challenge behavior and call for decisions. They're not stories for stories' sake. They're stories that are designed to not let you stay the same. They're stories designed to make you see, can you see a bit of this in you? And can you see that you need to change? And if you are going to be my follower, my disciple, you're going to have to learn how to live life God's way, and change is going to be required. So sometimes we'll find some of the parables will end with, outright challenges like, go and do likewise. Well, that doesn't leave much room, does it, for umming and ahhing? Or other parables will start with a question, which of you, if da-di-da-di-da?
Yeah.
And you end up thinking, I suppose I would, wouldn't I? Really. So it's really easy to miss how very searching and challenging some of these are, and, to end up poking in corners of our imagination about what the story might have meant. And then we miss this searching nature of Jesus trying to get us to see where our life is at and help us move from that to living life God's way.
And it sounds also as if it depends on who Jesus was addressing with the parable in terms of how they were then going to search themselves.
Yes. I mean, we find very different reactions to parables in the Gospels and parables elsewhere in the Scriptures, by the way. There will be times when people will resent very much. Who are you to talk to us like that? Now, that was true of, say, the Pharisees, the priests, the rabbis, when they knew that Jesus was telling a parable against them. It might be true of Israel itself. Think of Isaiah's parable of the vineyard in Isaiah chapter 5, where people knew he was telling this parable against Israel itself. But for others, these would be parables of life, as they saw that there was hope for even them, even for someone who'd been a terrible sinner and yet who threw himself on God's mercy. In Jesus's parable, we hear that it's this sinner who finds forgiveness from God, rather than the self-righteous Pharisee who's full of all his supposed good works. So there will be different reactions and responses. There were in his day, there still will be today. And if we find ourselves reacting, I would say it's just good to stop and say, why? Why are you reacting at that? What is it that you are trying to preserve in your own life? What is it about Jesus' teaching you don't like at this point, and why?
To what extent is there a danger we can misinterpret the parables?
Oh, it's very, very easy to do. And again, it's easy to do it because we just yank the parable from Jesus' time to today and don't put ourselves back in the context of understanding and asking ourselves, what is actually the fundamental question every time we come to any passage of the Bible? What did this mean then? What would its original hearers or readers have understood from this story? Because if we miss that step, we'll just yank it into something in the 21st century and make it relate to us. Or we might pick up on one little word and make it want to mean something that we want it to mean. And there have been classic examples of getting this wrong throughout church history. One of the perhaps best known was that wonderful theologian in most other respects, St. Augustine, who came out with some incredible insights into Scripture. Mm-hmm. But when it came to parables, he took an approach whereby the parable and each of its points pointed to something else. And what he forgot, and what many people forget today, is that usually parables just have one main point. Oh. And even if there are sub-points, they're all feeding that one main point. So, there might be 4 seeds going into different types of soil in the parable of the sower in Matthew 13. But the one point is, what's the condition of the soil? What's the condition of your heart? Rather than separate single points.
So did St. Augustine sort of approach the parables as if they were allegories?
Yeah, he absolutely allegorized. And the thing is, in his day, allegory was a big thing. So, he sort of interpreted it culturally, always a challenge, still today. But the way he did it, is quite funny perhaps to us now, though, he did this with really good intention. But what he did was, rather than looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan as a story that answered a question, because what kicked off that parable was a question: who is my neighbor? And in answer to the question, who is my neighbor, Jesus said, well, it's a bit like this. Mm-hmm. A man was going on a journey from Jerusalem to Jericho when he got mugged. And he tells the whole story.
Yeah.
And the whole story answers, who is my neighbor? And of course, the answer is anyone who's in need, no matter what their background or belief or whether you like them or not. But what Augustine did was he spiritualized it. He allegorized it. And so he turned the whole parable into, if you like, a picture of the whole gospel. So for him, the man on the journey who was beaten up becomes Adam.
Oh.
Jerusalem, where he set out from, was the heavenly city, paradise from, where Adam originally fell. Jericho, that he's going down to, he stands for, it's the city of the moon, so it stands for our mortality. The thieves that attacked him, well, that was the devil and all his demons.
Oh, right.
Their stripping of him was his losing of his immortality. Their beating him up was them persuading him to sin. His leaving him half dead was separating him from God.
Right.
The priest and the Levite who came by, what was this? Oh, well, that was the ministry of the Old Testament that couldn't really save anybody. And the Good Samaritan was, yes, it was Jesus. It's a bit like in Sunday school, isn't it? The answer's always Jesus. So the Good Samaritan was Jesus. The binding up of his wounds was the restraining of his sin. The oil that he poured in was the comfort of good hope. The wine he gave him was the exhortation to work with a fervent spirit. The donkey was the flesh of Christ's incarnation that carried him home. The four legs of the donkey, this is the one I love, were the four Gospels. The inn that he was taken to was the church, which keeps us safe till we're taken home. The 2 coins he paid were the promise of this life and the life to come. He confessed he wasn't quite sure about the innkeeper, but he thought that was probably St. Paul. Now,
I shouldn't laugh, but I mean, the thing is, people,
well, I think you should laugh, really.
But people took this seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the thing is, it sounds deeply spiritual. And I'm not maligning the guy. He did some great stuff. But he simply interpreted parables wrong, as any scholar would tell you today. And in a sense, we ought to laugh at it. But we can do the same. I've heard preachers still do the same today. Now, is the Bible meant to speak to us today? Of course it is. But it speaks to us today best when we understand how it spoke to them then. And the parable was simply an answer to the question, who is my neighbour? Now, that long detail that I read out, I had to read it from a list because I can't remember all the details myself. But it shows you how far he drifted away. So we've got this wonderful picture of the gospel. But what it lets us do is avoid the searching, challenging nature of the parable. Because we've done all that and we sit there and, oh yeah, we've had all those good insights, but I've failed to answer that question. Who is my neighbour? Well, I'll tell you who my neighbour is today. It's anybody, absolutely anybody, even people I don't like Jews didn't like Samaritans, and Samaritans didn't like Jews. It's anybody to whom I can offer help today in any way whatsoever, no matter what their creed, colour, background, persuasion, anything else. That's your neighbour today. Now go out and serve your neighbour. But interpreting the parable in the other way, lets me avoid that completely. And still today, there are far too many interpretations of parables that sound very clever, but actually end up letting us avoid the challenge that Jesus brings to live life God's way.
It certainly sounds as if what Jesus was doing was wanting to make us think and also do something.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think any of these are designed for intellectual stimulation. I mean, they do stimulate you into, you're going to have to think some of these things through, like the disciples did, and at times come back and said, Lord, I'm not quite grasping this. What does it mean? But each time they are designed to provoke us to action as Jesus shows us what life is like in God's kingdom and what God calls us to if we're going to be a follower of Jesus. We can't leave it as that was a nice story, wasn't it? If we end up thinking that was a nice story, we've almost certainly missed the point.
You mentioned God's kingdom. What are you talking about?
Well, this was the heart of Jesus's message. The message of God's kingdom is that God is king over all the earth. That was a fundamental teaching of the Old Testament, right from the beginning. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. God was creator and sustainer of everything and therefore king over everything. But of course, people had rebelled against that. Ever since Adam and Eve sinned, people had walked away from his kingly rule, bending the knee to him as king. But the prophets looked forward to the day when Messiah would come and bring that kingly rule back again. Now, for Jews, they expected that to be in a cataclysmic event that would involve Messiah raising up an army, whopping those Romans, clearing them out of the land and setting up the kingdom of God on earth. Jesus teaches it's not going to be like that. God's kingly rule is breaking into this world now. Why? Because the king has broken into this world now. And wherever people will bow the knee to him and receive him as king, life starts to change. And yet the Bible also tells us that Jesus is coming again at the end of the age. And on that day, we will then see the kingdom of God in all its full manifestation, with all evil removed and only God's rule and reign remaining. So God's kingdom is God's rule. It's what life looks like when you let God in, when you let God take charge, when you let God start to rule. And that's where Jesus's parables and miracles are like two sides of a coin, because his miracles were a demonstration of God's kingdom. He said, look, this is what happens when you let God in. People get healed. Demons flee. Skin diseases suddenly heal up. Things get transformed utterly. So his miracles are a demonstration. Look, this is what it's like. But his parables, are the flip side, they're an explanation of the kingdom. The miracles, a demonstration of the kingdom. The parables, an explanation of the kingdom. They're saying, let me tell you what it's like. Let me tell you how it works. Let me tell you how it gets worked out in practice. Let me tell you how it's going to challenge you. Let me show you how life's going to have to change if you follow me. So they're the two sides of this message of God's kingdom, God's rule. Life changes when we let God in and truly be king of every part of our life. There's a little phrase that Jesus uses about 150 times in the Gospels, and it's translated in different ways in our English Bibles, but we often see it as, I tell you. Or John has a particular way of saying it, very truly I tell you, or those who are familiar with the older version, verily, verily, I say unto you. I tell you. What he's saying is, listen very carefully, because your life depends on you grasping this. Oh yeah, it might sound a simple story, But listen, think, digest, apply. Your life depends on this. Sometimes the parables will be a little deeper, a little more complex, deliberately so. Because he'll want people to think things through, and those who think they've got it will just harden their hearts against it. And Jesus will talk about that in Matthew 13, how the prophecy of Isaiah will be fulfilled in them about the way they'll harden their heart by refusing to listen very carefully. But if I could leave our listeners with any one thing as we introduce this whole series, sure, we're going to look at parables that you're probably very familiar with. But my appeal would be, as we hear them again, listen very carefully. Because I think you'll find Jesus has some surprising things to say as he unveils to us what it means to live life God's way.
Bible expert Mike Beaumont explaining the parables of Jesus to David Taverner. Bible Parables in 30 Minutes is just one of a series of podcasts from Mike and David that help to make sense of the Bible, some of them recorded on location in the Holy Land and beyond. You can check them all out on the easy-to-use app UCB Player or wherever you listen to your podcasts.